You're listening to Lunaverse Chronicles, where fated bonds are forged and broken.
The scent of blood and rage was a thick, coppery fog in the air, choking the grand hall of the Black Fang Fortress. It was a smell Kaelen knew intimately, one that clung to his skin and his throne. But tonight it was underscored by something else. Something foul and cloying that made his wolf snarl in disgust. The scent of his enemy. He stood on the dais, a mountain of contained violence, his knuckles white as they gripped the carved obsidian arms of his throne. Below him, ringed by a dozen of his most brutal warriors, stood the delegation from the Sunstone Pack. Their leader, the old Alpha Orin, was a grizzled fox of a man, his face a mask of false diplomacy. But Kaelen's gaze wasn't on the Alpha. It was locked on the woman standing silently beside him, Elara, the Luna of the Sunstone Pack, Orin's mate. She was a vision of icy composure, her posture impossibly straight, her hands folded before her. The deep blue of her gown was a splash of cool night in the torchlit hall of black stone and warm pelts. Her platinum hair, like molten moonlight, was a stark contrast to the dark, wild manes of his own people. She was beautiful, in the way a glacier is beautiful, untouchable, remote, and dangerous. You come into my territory, into my very home, and speak of trespass. Kaelen's voice was a low growl, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. Your hunters crossed the Serpent River, Orin. They killed a stag on my land. That is not a misunderstanding. It is a provocation. Orin spread his hands, a placating gesture that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. King Kaelen, it was an error. The river flooded its banks last moon. The old markers were washed away. My men were simply following a trail. Must we spill more blood over a single deer? It was never about the deer, Kaelen snarled, leaning forward. The movement was predatory, and the warriors around them tensed. It is about the scent you left on my soil. It is about the challenge you think I am too blind to see. You test my borders because you think me weak. A flicker of movement from Elara. Her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Her eyes, a color he refused to name, swept over him, and he felt a strange, unwelcome jolt. It wasn't fear he saw in her gaze. It was assessment. Cold, clinical assessment, as if she were dissecting a tactical problem. It infuriated him. My king, Orin said, his tone shifting to one of weary reason. We are both alphas of powerful packs. This constant skirmishing benefits no one. There are other threats in these mountains. Perhaps it is time to discuss a true armistice. Kaelen's lip curled. An armistice? You speak of peace while your claws are still wet with my pack's blood. The only thing I will discuss are the terms of your surrender. The air crackled with tension. Kaelen could feel the heat building under his skin, a familiar, dangerous thrum that had been plaguing him for days, the early signs of his rut. It made his temper shorter, his control more brittle. The conflicting scents in the room, fear, aggression, and that maddeningly serene, floral scent that was uniquely Elara's, were sandpaper on his raw nerves. You are a king who rules by fear and force alone, Orin retorted, his own composure cracking. It is a brittle way to rule. A pack built on such a foundation will shatter. My pack is strong because I am strong, Kaelen roared, surging to his feet. The force of his movement sent a tremor through the dais. We do not cower behind pretty words and poisoned treaties. As he stood, a wave of dizziness hit him, hot and sudden. The world swam for a moment, the torches blurring into streaks of fire. The rut, it was coming on faster than he'd anticipated. The stress of this confrontation was accelerating it. A low, involuntary growl rumbled in his chest, deeper and more bestial than before. The scent of his own impending frenzy, of raw, dominant alpha, flooded the hall, overpowering all others. His own warriors took a step back, bowing their heads in instinctual submission. Orin's eyes widened, the mask of diplomacy finally falling away to reveal stark understanding. He knew what was happening. He could smell it. Orin breathed, a cruel, knowing smile twisting his lips. So that's it. The great Alpha King is on the brink of his rut. No wonder you're so volatile. Your control is slipping. Kaelen's vision tunneled. The only thing he could see was Orin's smug face. The urge to leap from the dais and tear out his throat was a primal scream in his blood. He took a heavy step forward, his breath coming in ragged pants. Get out! Kaelen gritted out, the words slurred with the beast fighting to take over. Get out of my sight before I forget I am a king. And remember, I am just a wolf. Oren, sensing a tactical advantage slipping away into unpredictable animal fury, began to back away, his guards closing around him. This isn't over, Kaelen. We will speak again when you are more yourself. They retreated quickly, a blur of retreating forms and fearful scents. But one figure remained, Elara. She hadn't moved. She stood as still as a statue, her sapphire gown a pool of stillness in the chaotic hall, her platinum hair gleaming. Her gaze was fixed on him, not with the fear or the predatory glee of her mate, but with that same unnerving calm. Elara, now. Oren barked from the doorway, his voice sharp with panic and command. She ignored him. Kaelen could feel the last vestiges of his control unraveling. The rut was afire in his veins, burning away reason, leaving only a raw, possessive need. The presence of any other wolf, especially one from a rival pack, was a direct threat. An Omega, even a bonded one, this close to him in this state. It was a recipe for catastrophic violence. Leave. The word was a guttural, barely human snarl, ripped from the depths of his being. He could feel his canines lengthening, his muscles coiling. He pointed a trembling hand towards the door, his whole body shaking with the effort of holding back the shift. "I'm in rut!" The declaration hung in the air, a final, absolute warning. Every wolf in the vicinity froze. An alpha's rut was a private, volatile thing, a time of immense vulnerability and uncontrollable strength. To be near one was to invite death. Elara took a single, deliberate step forward, not towards the exit, but towards him. The hall was utterly silent, save for Kaelen's ragged breathing. Her movement was so contrary to all instinct, to all sense, that it seemed to stop time itself. She looked at him, this wild, enraged king on the verge of becoming a pure force of nature. And her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the red haze of his fury like a shard of ice. "Then I'll stay." For a long, suspended moment, there was only the sound of Kaelen's harsh breathing. Her words, so simple, so impossibly foolish, echoed in the vast, tense silence of the hall. "Then I'll stay." They weren't a challenge, nor were they a plea. They were a statement of fact, as immutable as the mountain upon which his fortress was built. And they enraged him more than any insult Oren could have hurled. The last of his control shattered. A roar, pure and bestial, tore from his throat. It was the sound of a wolf, not a man. He launched himself from the dais, not with the grace of a king, but with the feral power of the beast taking over. He crossed the space between them in a blur of black and fury, his intent clear in the lethal focus of his charge. He would tear her apart. His warriors, trained to a razor's edge, moved on pure instinct. Two of them, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, threw themselves in his path. They were large, formidable betas, but against an alpha in the full, blinding throes of a rut, they were nothing. Kaelen didn't even break his stride. He swatted one aside with a backhanded blow that sent the man crashing into a stone pillar with a sickening crack. The other he grabbed by the throat, lifting him off his feet before hurling him across the room like a discarded toy. The message was clear. Do not interfere. His burning gaze snapped back to Elara. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't cried out. She simply stood there, watching him come, her hands still folded, her posture impossibly erect. Her composure was a shield, and it was the most maddening thing he had ever witnessed. He was upon her in the next heartbeat, his hand, already clawed and shifting, clamping around her throat. He didn't squeeze, not yet, but the threat was there, the pressure a promise of the violence he was barely containing. Her pulse hammered against his palm, a frantic, trapped bird. Finally, a sign of life, of fear. "Your mate," Kaelen snarled, his voice a distorted, gravelly thing, "fled like a coward. He left you here, to me. Do you understand what that means?" He leaned in, inhaling her scent. It wasn't the cloying sweetness of a submissive Omega in heat. It was cool, like night-blooming jasmine and fresh snow, a scent that somehow cut through the fire in his blood, not quenching it, but sharpening it. It means he values his own hide more than his Luna's. It means you are a pawn he was willing to sacrifice. Elara's eyes, wide and unblinking, held his. Her breath hitched, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "He did not leave me. I chose to stay. Why?" The word was a guttural demand. To spy, to poison me? To watch me unravel and report my weakness back to him? His fingers twitched against her skin. It was soft. Unbelievably soft. The contrast between his brutal, calloused hand and her delicate throat was a dissonance that rattled him. No. Then why? He roared, the sound shaking dust from the rafters. Because a rut-mad alpha king, left alone with only his rage, is a danger to everyone in this fortress, she said, her gaze unwavering. And because a king who is seen to be so out of control is a king who will soon face a challenge he cannot win. Your pack's stability hangs by a thread. Oren knows it. Your warriors know it. And you, in this state, are too blind to see it. Her words were like a bucket of ice water thrown on the inferno of his instincts. They weren't about her, or him, or even their enmity. They were about politics, about the cold, hard calculus of power. It was the last thing he expected, the only thing that could have pierced the red haze. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The beast in him screamed to silence her, to dominate, to claim. But the man, the king buried deep beneath the frenzy, was listening. She was right. If he locked himself away for the week of his rut, the rumors would fly. Oren would spin a tale of a weakened, unstable king. Dissent would fester. His own betas might see an opportunity. He was vulnerable. And she, the Luna of his enemy, had just pointed it out to him. The sheer, brazen insanity of her presence, of her logic, finally registered. He released her throat so abruptly she stumbled back a step, a faint red mark already blooming on her pale skin. She brought a hand up to touch it, her composure finally cracking with a flicker of surprise. "Get out," he said again, but the command had lost its feral edge. It was the weary, strained order of a man fighting a war on two fronts, one against his own biology, the other against the viper's nest of pack politics. "You are not safe to be left alone," she repeated, her voice firm. "You need an anchor, something to tether the man to the beast. And you think you can be that anchor?" He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You are from the pack that seeks to see me fall. Your presence is a whetstone on my rage." "Precisely," she said, a strange calculating light in her eyes. "Your hatred for me is a clean, focused thing. It is simpler than the chaotic fury of the rut. You can use it. Channel the chaos into that hatred. Focus on me, on your loathing for my presence. And it might be enough to keep the king in control while the wolf rages." He was stunned into silence. She was proposing to use herself as a psychological tool, a lightning rod for his madness. It was the most reckless, brilliant, and suicidal plan he had ever heard. And the worst part was, he could feel the twisted logic of it working. The all-consuming need of the rut was now competing with the sharp, pointed irritation of her presence. She was a puzzle, an enemy standing where no enemy should be able to stand. And his mind, desperate for any anchor, was latching onto the mystery of her. He turned away from her, stalking towards the heavy oak doors that led to his private chambers. The movement was stiff, every muscle screaming in protest. "Fine," he bit out, not looking back. "You want to stay? You will be my prisoner. You will not leave my sight. You will not speak unless spoken to. You are a tool, nothing more. And the moment you cease to be useful, or the moment I suspect treachery, I will kill you. Do you understand?" He heard the soft rustle of her velvet gown as she followed him. "I understand, Alpha King." "Kaelen," he snapped, shoving the doors open. "You have invited yourself into my rut. You will use my name." He strode into his chambers, a sprawling suite of rooms that reflected the man, Spartan, built of stone and dark wood, dominated by a massive bed and a large fireplace. The door slammed shut behind them, the heavy thud echoing with a sense of finality. They were locked in together, the rut-mad Alpha and the enemy Luna, who had chosen to walk into his cage. He turned to face her, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his tormented features. The rut was a rising tide inside him, and her jasmine and snow scent was now the only clean thing in the world. A siren's call he was sworn to resist. "Now," Kaelen growled, the beast resurfacing, his eyes glowing with predatory intent. "We begin." The first wave of the rut was a physical blow, a seismic shift that dropped Kaelen to his knees in the center of the room. A guttural groan was torn from him, his body bowing under the onslaught of pure, undiluted instinct. It was a fire in his marrow, a demand for release, for conquest, for a claiming so absolute it would scorch the earth. His vision swam, the edges blurring into a haze of red and gold from the fire. He was aware of her, a still, silent point in the storm of his senses. Her scent was everywhere, that cool jasmine and snow, an agony and a relief. It was the scent of an Omega, but it lacked the desperate, pleading pull of a heat. It was controlled, like the woman herself, and that control was a provocation. His wolf saw it as a challenge to be broken. Get away from the door, he managed to grit out, his voice thick and unrecognizable. He couldn't have her near the only exit. The primal part of him would interpret any move towards escape as a hunt. He heard the soft whisper of velvet on stone as she moved, not towards the far walls, but laterally, circling him at a cautious distance. He tracked her movement through slitted eyes, his head pounding. She stopped near the large, unlit hearth, placing a hand on the cold mantle as if to steady herself. She was watching him, studying him like a physician might study a fascinating, deadly disease. Does it always hit you this hard? Her voice was quiet, devoid of fear, filled with a clinical curiosity that was somehow more intimate than pity. He let out a sharp, pained laugh that ended in a cough. What do you care? Gathering intelligence for your mate? I am gathering information to keep myself alive, she corrected him bluntly. The more I understand the rhythms of this, the better I can anticipate your actions. My survival depends on it. Her cold pragmatism was a lifeline, something for his rational mind to cling to. He focused on the anger it sparked, using it to build a wall against the raw need. It's worse, he admitted, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a fresh wave of dizziness. The stress, the confrontation, it acts as an accelerant. He heard her take a slow, measured breath. Then you must find a way to bleed the pressure. The rage, the physical energy, you cannot simply endure it. You must direct it. Direct it where? He snarled, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees, his muscles quivering with the strain. At you? If that is what it takes. Her calm was infuriating. He surged to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and stalked towards her. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, his heat radiating onto her, his scent enveloping her. She had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. But she didn't retreat, even when his hands slammed into the stone mantle on either side of her, caging her in. Is this what you want, Luna? He breathed, his face inches from hers. The scent of her was intoxicating this close, a clean, sharp fragrance that made his head spin. To see the beast up close? To see what your mate is too cowardly to face? Her eyes searched his face, not with the terror he craved, but with that same unnerving assessment. I see a king at war with himself. The beast is a part of you, Kaelen, but it is not all of you. You are fighting it as if it is a separate entity to be conquered. Perhaps you should stop fighting. Her words, so close to a truth he'd never acknowledged, startled him. He pushed away from the mantle, turning his back on her as another shudder racked his frame. He paced the length of the room like a caged animal, his restlessness a physical force. You speak in riddles. I speak from observation, she said, her gaze following his frantic movements. Your pack is a reflection of you. All force, no finesse. All dominance, no subtlety. You rule your own nature the same way. You try to dominate the rut instead of riding its currents. He stopped pacing and whirled on her. And you, the Luna of the peaceful Sunstone pack, are an expert on an alpha's rut? I am an expert on power, she replied, her voice hardening for the first time. On how it is gained, how it is held, and how it is lost. Your power is fracturing from the inside out, right now, in this room, and you are too proud to see that the only one offering you a way to hold it together is your enemy. The accusation hung in the air, stark and undeniable. She was right. His warriors had seen him lose control. Orin had seen it, and now she was seeing the full, ugly extent of it. His authority, built over a decade of ruthless strength, was being eroded by his own biology. A fresh, more intense wave of feverish heat crashed over him, and he stumbled, catching himself on the heavy wooden post of his bed. The need was becoming a deafening roar, a physical ache that demanded submission, a partner, His gaze snapped to her. The sapphire velvet of her gown, the fall of her platinum hair over her shoulder, the elegant line of her neck. The beast within him surged, presenting a single brutal solution to the agony. Take her, claim her, make her yours. It will stop the pain. A low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest, unbidden. Elara went very still. For the first time, he saw a flicker of true apprehension in her eyes. She understood the shift in the air, the change in the quality of his silence. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by the immediate, palpable threat of the primal. "Kaelen," she said, her voice low and firm. A command. "Look at me. Not as a wolf looks at prey. Look at me as a king looks at an ambassador. Remember who you are." Her words were a lash, snapping against his consciousness. He blinked, the red haze receding slightly. He saw her then, not just as an Omega, but as Elara, the Luna of his enemy, the woman who had stayed, the infuriating, intelligent, and dangerously brave woman, who was currently the only thing standing between him and total savagery. He pushed away from the bedpost, his breath still ragged, but the murderous intent had receded, replaced by a grinding, exhausting war of attrition. "You," he panted, pointing a trembling finger at her, "are the most maddening creature I have ever met." A ghost of a smile, the first he had ever seen on her face, touched her lips. It was a small, weary thing, but it transformed her entirely. "Then I am serving my purpose. Your focus is on your annoyance with me, not on the rut." He stared at her, a strange, hollow feeling spreading in his chest alongside the fever. She was using herself as a shield, and it was working. The realization was as humbling as it was terrifying. His enemy, his prisoner, had become his keeper, and he had no idea what to do with that. The ghost of her smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but its echo remained, a seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. The dynamic had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a prisoner or a tool. She had proven her effectiveness, and they both knew it. The knowledge hung between them, a fragile, unspoken truce built on the paradoxical foundation of their enmity. The rut came in waves. After the crest of that first violent peak, a temporary trough of exhaustion followed. Kaelen slumped into a large, high-backed chair by the dead fireplace, his body drenched in sweat, his limbs feeling heavy and foreign. The fire in his blood had banked to a smolder, but the embers were still dangerously hot, ready to flare with the slightest provocation. He watched her through half-lidded eyes. Elara had moved to the far side of the room, putting a respectful, or perhaps merely strategic, distance between them. She stood by a narrow arrow-slit window, the pale moonlight catching the silver threads in her gown and turning her hair into a cascade of liquid mercury. She was looking out at the night, her profile serene, but he could see the tense line of her shoulders. She wasn't as unaffected as she pretended. "Why did he really leave you?" Kaelen's voice was rough, scraped raw from growls and pain. The question emerged from the silence, born of exhaustion and a gnawing curiosity he could no longer suppress. Elara didn't turn. "I told you. I chose to stay." "That's not an answer," he countered, the familiar irritation a welcome anchor. "Oren is many things, but a fool is not one of them. Leaving his Luna in the hands of his rut-mad enemy, it makes him look weak. It makes you look expendable. He gains nothing from it, doesn't he?" she asked softly, her gaze still fixed on the night. "If you kill me, you martyr me. My death becomes a rallying cry, a justification for all-out war. The Sunstone Pack would fight with the fury of the wronged, and the other packs would see you as a monstrous king who murders defensum Lunas. Your alliances would crumble." Kaelen stilled, the logic of it cold and sharp. He hadn't considered that. He had been too consumed by the personal insult, the perceived challenge. But she was right. Oren was playing a longer, more cynical game. Her life was a chess piece, and her sacrifice would be a checkmate. "And if I don't kill you?" Kaelen asked, his voice low. "If you survive this, what then? You return to him, having seen me at my most vulnerable, having shared my confinement? Do you think he would welcome you back with open arms after that? The scent of my rut will be all over you." He saw her shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. It was the first real crack he'd seen in her armor regarding her own situation. She had been so focused on managing him, she'd perhaps not fully considered the consequences for herself. "That is a problem for another day," she said, her tone final, closing the subject. But Kaelen wouldn't let it go. A new, ugly thought was taking root, or perhaps that's the point. he mused, a dark suspicion coiling in his gut. Perhaps you are the poison. He leaves you here, knowing the rut will make it difficult, nearly impossible, for me to resist claiming an Omega. If I touch you, if I bond with you, even forcibly, it would shatter the alliance I have with the northern clans. It would be a betrayal of the highest order. It would make me an oathbreaker, another path to my downfall, and all without a single battle. Now she turned from the window. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her expression unreadable. You give him too much credit, and me too little. Then explain it, he demanded, his exhaustion making him sharp. What is your play here, Elara? What do you gain from this suicide mission? For a long moment she was silent. The only sound was their breathing, his still labored, hers eerily calm. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. Freedom. The word landed in the room with the weight of a stone. It was the last thing he expected. It was too simple, too profound, and too dangerous. Freedom from what? He pressed, bewildered. From my gilded cage, she said, a trace of bitterness finally coloring her tone. From being a symbol. From the endless smiling diplomacy and the weight of a title that comes with no true power. You think you are the only one chained by your position? You wear your chains of power openly. They are made of iron and blood. Mine are made of silk and expectation. And they are just as constricting. She took a step away from the window, her gaze intense. For 1 week, Kaelen, I am not the Luna of the Sunstone Pack. I am not Oren's mate. I am not a political pawn. In this room, I am just a woman who made a choice. A stupid, reckless, potentially fatal choice. But it was my choice. And that for me is a novelty so intoxicating it is worth the risk of your teeth at my throat. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He had seen the icy Luna, the calculating strategist. Now he saw the prisoner inside that role, a spirit as wild and untamable in its own way as his own. They were mirrors reflecting each other's cages. His was forged in battle, hers in diplomacy, but they were both prisons nonetheless. The realization was a potent, disarming thing. The hatred he was supposed to be channeling became muddied, complicated by a thread of something dangerously close to understanding. Another wave of heat began to build within him, a low thrum that promised a return of the agony. He clenched his jaw, fighting it. He could feel the beast stirring, its focus zeroing in on her once more. But now the desire was laced with this new, confounding knowledge. He pushed himself out of the chair, his movements stiff. He needed a different outlet, a way to bleed the pressure that didn't involve focusing on her, ignoring her. He strode to the clear space in the center of the room and began the slow, deliberate movements of a warrior's kata. It was a form of meditation in motion, each punch, each block, each pivot a way to channel the chaotic energy into a controlled pattern. He poured his frustration, his confusion, the fire of the rut, and the startling image of Elara in a gilded cage into every movement. He was a whirlwind of contained violence, his body sweating, his breaths coming in sharp gusts. He didn't look at her, but he was acutely aware of her presence, of her watching him. He wasn't doing this for her. He was doing it to prove to himself that he could. To prove that her assessment of him, all force, no finesse, was wrong. When he finally finished, his chest heaving, the worst of the rising wave had passed. He stood panting in the silence, the stone floor cool beneath his bare feet. A soft sound broke the quiet. He turned. Elara was still standing by the window, but she had moved slightly. One of her hands was extended, resting on the back of the chair he had vacated, as if for support. Her usual mask of composure was gone. In its place was an expression of raw, undisguised awe. In that unguarded moment, she wasn't the enemy Luna or the trapped noblewoman. She was simply a woman witnessing a display of raw power, and for the first time she wasn't assessing it. She was feeling it, and the look in her eyes, the one she quickly tried to hide, sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the rut, and everything to do with the man beneath the beast. The unguarded awe on Elara's face lasted only a heartbeat before the familiar mask of composure slid back into place. But the image was seared into Kaelen's mind, a fleeting glimpse of the woman beneath the Luna that was more intoxicating than any scent. The air in the room, thick with the pheromonal storm of his rut, now crackled with a new, more complicated energy. He turned away, Feigning a need to adjust the non-existent fire, using the movement to hide the disorientation her look had caused, the beast within him was confused. Its single-minded drive to claim now tangled with a burgeoning curiosity about this enigmatic prisoner, who looked at him not with fear, but with something resembling respect. The rut, however, was a relentless master. The respite granted by the kata was brief. A fresh, more insidious wave began to build, this one not of raging fire, but of a deep, aching hollowness. It was a need for connection, for warmth, for the comfort of a pack that went beyond the hierarchical. It was a vulnerability far more dangerous than rage. He found himself pacing again, but the movements were slower, less frantic. His gaze kept drifting back to her, not with predatory intent, but with a sort of wretched fascination. The silence between them was no longer just tense. It was charged with all the things they had not said. "It must be difficult," Elara said suddenly, her voice soft, breaking the quiet. She had settled into the chair he'd vacated, her hands folded in her lap, watching him pace. To bear it alone, an alpha's rut is meant to be shared with his pack, to reinforce bonds. To sequester yourself like this, it goes against nature. Kaelen stopped his pacing, his back to her. Her perception was unnerving. She saw too much. Sharing it would be a show of weakness, he stated, the old dogma feeling hollow even to his own ears. An alpha must be seen as invincible. The rut is a private trial, a purification through fire. Is that what this feels like? Purification? Her tone was not mocking, but genuinely inquisitive. It looks like torment. He let out a long, weary breath. It is both. He finally turned to face her. The raw need was a physical ache in his chest, a yawning chasm that the beast insisted only an Omega could fill. But looking at her, the idea of taking her by force, of violating the strange, fragile truce that had sprung up between them, felt abhorrent. It was a realization that shocked him to his core. "My first rut after I took the throne," he found himself saying, the words coming unbidden. "I spent in the dungeons, chained to the wall. I tore the manacles from the stone 3 times before they finally held." He saw her flinch, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. "Why are you telling me this?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. "Perhaps to prove that your assessment of me as a blunt instrument is not entirely wrong. Perhaps so you understand that the control I am exhibiting now is not my norm." He took a step towards her, then another, not with the aggressive stalk of before, but with a slow, almost hesitant approach. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to feel the cool aura of her presence, a balm against his fevered skin. The need to touch, to simply feel the solid reality of another being, was a desperate thrum in his veins. "Your hand?" he said, his voice gravelly. Elara's eyes widened. She didn't move. "What?" "Your hand," he repeated, the request feeling both humiliating and necessary. "I just need an anchor. Something real. Not a memory of chains. Not the ghost of a battle." He met her gaze, letting her see the stark, unvarnished struggle within him. "You offered yourself as a tool. This is the tool I require at this moment." It was a colossal risk. He was showing her a vulnerability far deeper than physical pain. He was admitting a need. For a long, suspended moment, he was certain she would refuse, that she would see it as a trick, a prelude to an attack. Then slowly, she unclasped her hands. She extended her right arm, turning her palm upward in a gesture of offering. Her hand was slender, pale, and looked impossibly delicate. Kaelen's own hand trembled as he reached out. He hesitated, his fingers hovering just above hers, the space between them crackling with tension. This was the line, the point of no return. To touch her willingly, without violence, was to acknowledge the connection forming between them, to betray the very enmity that defined their worlds. He let his fingertips brush against her palm. A jolt, sharp and clear, shot up his arm. It wasn't the electric shock of passion he might have expected, but something quieter, more profound. It was a sensation of stillness. Her skin was cool, her pulse a steady, quiet rhythm against his own frantic one. The chaotic static of the rut, the screaming need, seemed to hush, as if her mere touch was a silencing spell. He let his hand settle fully over hers, his larger, calloused palm engulfing her slender fingers. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull her closer. He just held on, his eyes slipping closed, his entire being focused on that single point of contact. He felt her tense at first, a natural reaction to the touch of her enemy. But then gradually he felt her relax. Her fingers uncurled slightly, not to hold his hand, but to accept its weight. She allowed the connection. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the Alpha King and the enemy Luna, joined only by the touch of their hands. The world narrowed to the space between their palms. The fire in his blood didn't vanish, but it banked, soothed by the simple human act of contact. The beast, for the first time since this ordeal began, was quiet. When he finally opened his eyes, he found her watching him, her expression unreadable. There was no fear, no pity, no triumph. There was only a deep, contemplative stillness that mirrored the one she had given him through her touch. He pulled his hand back as if burned, the loss of contact feeling like a physical wound. The noise of the rut rushed back in, but it was muted, manageable. "Thank you," he said, the words foreign and awkward on his tongue. Elara slowly retracted her hand, folding it back into her lap. She gave a single slight nod. No words were necessary. The line had been crossed. The nature of their confinement had changed forever. They were no longer just warden and prisoner, nor simply enemies. They had become accomplices in a shared, private war against the darkness within him. And Kaelen had the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that he was no longer sure which side of the war he was on. The silence that followed was a different entity than any that had come before. It was not the tense quiet of predator and prey, nor the exhausted stillness after a storm. It was a thick, living thing, heavy with the unspoken significance of what had just transpired. The ghost of her touch lingered on Kaelen's skin, a cool brand that had soothed the fire even as it ignited a new, more confusing one in its wake. He retreated to the far side of the room, putting the massive bed between them like a bulwark. He needed the distance, not from her, but from the part of himself that wanted to cross back over, to feel that grounding stillness again. The rut was a dull, persistent ache in his bones, but the sharp, jagged edges had been filed down. His mind, clearer than it had been in days, was now a battlefield of a different kind. He had touched the Luna of his enemy. He had sought comfort from her. And she had given it. What did that make him? What did that make them? Elara had risen from the chair and returned to her post by the window, but her posture was different. The rigid, diplomatic straightness was gone, replaced by a more natural curve, one of contemplation. She occasionally flexed the hand he had held, as if she too could feel the echo of the contact. "It's dawn," she said softly, her voice cutting through his turbulent thoughts. He hadn't noticed. He looked towards the arrow-slit window. A faint grayish light was seeping into the room, pushing back the deep shadows. The first night was over. They had survived it. Not just survived, they had navigated it. The realization was staggering. "The first 24 hours are said to be the worst," Kaelen said, his voice rough from disuse and growling. He leaned against the cold stone wall, the chill a welcome sensation against his back. "The fever peaks, the instincts are at their most volatile." "And after?" she asked, still looking out at the growing light. "It plateaus. The need remains, a constant pressure. But the mind can sometimes surface for air. The control becomes less of a battle and more of a grim endurance." He paused, then added, "Or so I'm told. I've never been this coherent at this stage, because you've always fought it alone, in chains." She turned her head slightly, her profile etched against the pale light. "You were wrong, you know, about it being a show of weakness. What I saw last night, that was not weakness. That was the strongest thing I have ever witnessed." Her words landed not as flattery, but as a simple, stark fact. They burrowed deep into a part of him he kept heavily guarded. He had built his kingdom on the foundation of being the strongest, the most ruthless, the most feared. Yet this woman, from the pack he despised, was telling him that his greatest display of strength was not in conquering others, but in not breaking himself. He had no answer for that. A low growl from his stomach broke the moment, a painfully mundane sound in their surreal circumstances. He'd eaten nothing since before the confrontation in the hall. As if on cue, a cautious knock sounded at the heavy door. A slot at the bottom, used for passing meals to prisoners or those in isolation, scraped open. "My king?" a nervous voice called from the other side. "Your provisions." Kaelen pushed off the wall. "Stay where you are," he commanded Elara, his tone automatically shifting back to that of a king giving orders. The instinct to protect, to shield her from even the gaze of his own men, was immediate and fierce. He strode to the door, his body still thrumming with residual energy, and retrieved the large tray that was pushed through. It was laden with enough roasted meat, dense bread, and water for two. His beta Rorik was a practical man. He would follow the order to keep the king confined, but he wouldn't let him starve, and he had clearly deduced the Luna was still alive and present. Kaelen carried the tray to the small, heavy table near the fireplace and set it down. The smell of food made him lightheaded with hunger. He tore off a chunk of bread and a piece of meat, devouring it without ceremony. He then poured a cup of water and drank it in one long, desperate gulp. Only then did he remember her. He looked up. Elara was still by the window, watching him. He felt a pang of something that might have been shame. He was behaving like an animal at a trough. "Eat," he said, his voice softer. She approached the table slowly, with that innate grace that seemed part of her very being. She took a smaller portion of bread and meat, and poured herself a cup of water. She did not sit, but stood opposite him, eating with a quiet deliberateness that was a world away from his own savage consumption. "Your man is loyal," she observed after a moment, "to provide for me as well. Rorik follows orders. I said you were not to be harmed. Starvation qualifies as harm." The words were curt, but the sentiment behind them felt newly complicated. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the simple act of sharing a meal feeling more intimate than the hand touch had been. It was domestic, normal, and in their situation it was utterly bizarre. "What will you do?" Elara asked, setting her empty cup down. "When this is over, assuming I survive." The question hung in the air between them. It was the question he had been avoiding. "The terms of our agreement stand," he said, falling back on the familiar ground of their bargain, though it now felt flimsy. "You will be returned to the border, unharmed. And then," she pressed, her gaze steady, "you will have spent a week in close confinement with me. Oren will use that. The rumors will fly. My pack will see me as tainted. Your pack will see you as compromised. The political landscape you were so concerned about preserving will be shattered." "I will deal with it," he growled, the old anger surfacing, not at her, but at the truth of her words. "How? By denying it happened? By claiming you killed me after all? Or by launching the war this entire situation was designed to provoke?" She took a step closer, her voice low and intent. "You have a choice now, Kaelen. A choice you didn't have when Oren walked into your hall." "What choice is that?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The choice to redefine the narrative." Her eyes were blazing with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "You can let Oren control the story of the rut-mad king and the captive Luna, or you can write your own." He stared at her, captivated and unnerved. "And what story would that be?" "The story of the Alpha King who showed mercy," she said, her words measured and precise. "The king who, even in the grip of his most primal state, honored the sanctity of a truce. The king who protected an enemy Omega when her own Alpha abandoned her. That is not a story of weakness, Kaelen. That is a story of legendary strength. It is a story that would make packs want to follow you, not just fear you." He was speechless. She was not just a strategist. She was a visionary. She was looking past the immediate conflict, past the bloodshed and the borders, towards a legacy. And she was offering him a path to it. "You would have me use you," he stated, understanding dawning. "Use your presence here as a political tool." "I am already a political tool," she replied without a trace of self-pity. "The only question is in whose hands and for what purpose. In Oren's hands, I am a weapon to destroy you. In yours, I could be the cornerstone of a lasting peace." Peace. The word was alien on his tongue. He had known only war, expansion, and defense. The concept of peace was for weaker men, for men like Oren who ruled with words instead of claws. But the image she painted? A kingdom not held together by fear but by loyalty. A legacy of strength that was also merciful. It was a seductive, terrifying prospect. The rut, simmering beneath the surface, chose that moment to remind him of its presence. A fresh wave of heat washed over him, less violent than before but more pervasive. A deep, throbbing need that made his knees feel weak. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, to the pale column of her throat where his mark had faded to a faint blush. The beast and the man were in sudden, perfect agreement. They didn't just want her politically, they wanted her. The woman with the mind of a general and the soul of a rebel. The woman who saw the king buried under the monster. He took a step towards her, the air thickening around them. The intellectual connection they had just forged now pulsed with a raw, physical current. The story she proposed was forgotten, replaced by a much more immediate, primal narrative. A lasting peace, he repeated, his voice a low rumble. He was close enough now to see the faint pulse at the base of her throat quicken. That is a lofty goal, Luna, but right now, all I can think of is a much more immediate future. Her breath hitched. She didn't retreat. The space between them was charged, a precipice they were both standing on. The line they had crossed with a touch was now a distant memory. They were about to leap into the abyss. The air in the room vanished. All that remained was the space between them, a charged void that pulled with the force of a collapsing star. Kaelen's world had narrowed to the rapid flutter of Elara's pulse in her throat, to the parting of her lips as she drew a sharp, silent breath. The intellectual connection, the political scheming, the fragile truce, it all shattered under the weight of a need so fundamental it felt like truth. He didn't grab her. He didn't command her. He simply closed the final, infinitesimal distance, his body not crashing into hers but aligning with it. His hands came up to frame her face. His touch not brutal, but possessive in a way that was entirely new. It was a question and a claim, all in one. Elara. Her name was a prayer and a surrender on his lips. He waited, for a protest, for a flinch, for the return of the Ice Queen. It didn't come. Instead, a shudder racked her frame, and her eyes, those pools of cool assessment, darkened with a storm of their own. Her own hands came up, not to push him away, but to clutch at the fabric of his black tunic, her knuckles white. It was the answer he hadn't dared to hope for. When his lips met hers, it was not a gentle exploration. It was a conflagration. The last of his control, the dam that had held back the rut's full force, burst. The kiss was a devouring, a claiming that was as much about the mind as it was the body. He was consuming her logic, her defiance, her very essence, and she met him with a fire he never knew she possessed. Her lips moved against his with a desperate, hungry fervor, her cool jasmine scent now blooming with the heat of her own response. It was the final irrevocable betrayal of their old lives, and they committed it together. He walked her back until her shoulders met the cold stone wall, his body pinning hers, not as a prison, but as a shelter. His mouth left her lips to trail a searing path down her jaw, to the frantic beat in her throat. He laved at the spot where his mark had been, and she gasped, her head falling back against the stone with a soft thud. Kaelen, she breathed, his name a broken plea. It was all the encouragement the beast needed. His hands slid from her face, down the elegant line of her back, pulling her flush against him. The hard planes of his body met her soft curves, and a groan was torn from him, a sound of pure, unadulterated need. The sapphire velvet of her gown was a frustrating barrier. He wanted skin. He wanted to feel her heart hammering against his own. He gripped the fabric at her shoulder, the intent to tear it away clear in the tension of his muscles. But then he stopped. He forced his head up, his breathing ragged, his entire body trembling with the effort. He looked into her eyes, which were hazy with a passion that mirrored his own. But beneath it, he saw the ghost of the strategist, the woman who had chosen this path with clear-eyed purpose. He would not take her like this, not against a wall in a frenzy, not as the beast. No, he gritted out, the word a testament to a war won deep within. Not like this. He took a staggering step back, putting a precious foot of space between them. The loss of her warmth was an agony, I will not be just another alpha who uses you. Not even with your consent born of this madness. Elara stared at him, her chest heaving, her lips swollen from his kisses. Confusion, desire, and a dawning, profound respect warred in her gaze. She understood. He was claiming her, but he was doing it as a king, not a monster. He reached for her hand again, his grip firm but gentle, and led her the few steps to his bed. He sat on the edge, pulling her down to stand between his knees. He looked up at her, his expression raw and open. "Stay," he commanded. But it was a request. With me, not as a prisoner. Not as a tool, stay. It was a different question entirely. It was a question that reached beyond the confines of the rut, beyond the walls of this room. It was a question about tomorrow. Tears she had not shed through fear or pain now glittered in her eyes. She brought a hand to his face, her touch cool and steadying. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of such profound intimacy it stole the air from his lungs. "I am already here," she whispered. That was all he needed. He laid her back on the furs, with a reverence that was entirely new to him. The removal of her gown was slow, deliberate, his hands mapping the territory of her skin as if committing it to memory. When he finally sheathed himself within her, it was not a conquest, but a homecoming, a joining. Her cry was not of pain, but of completion, and as her body arched against his, as her teeth scraped gently against the bonding gland on his neck, in a silent mutual promise, the last of the rut's torment melted away. It was not the frantic, desperate coupling of an alpha's frenzy. It was slower, deeper, a rhythm that spoke of a future being forged in the dim light of the room. When the peak finally crashed over them, it was not a violent rupture, but a tidal wave of overwhelming peace. He spilled his seed inside her with a groan that was her name. And as he collapsed beside her, gathering her shaking form against his side, he knew, with a certainty that shook the foundations of his soul, that nothing would ever be the same.
If you need more dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your next Omegaverse love story is coming soon.